There is no leverage, little bird. They want a grave.
Chapter 1. The Intake. The transport bus smelled of diesel fumes, stale urea, and the specific metallic scent of terror. It was a sensory assault designed to break the spirit before the body even stepped onto the concrete. Jane sat in the rear cage, her wrists shackled to her waist, her ankles chained to the floor. The steel cuffs bit into her skin with every vibration of the vehicle. She kept her head down, letting her greasy, matted hair cover her face. To the U.S. Marshals in the front cab, she was inmate 8930, a drifter picked up for a double homicide in a bar fight. A cover story fabricated by the agency's best forgers. To the world, she was trash. To the mission, she was a Trojan horse. The bus lurched to a halt. The air brakes hissed, a long, mournful sigh that echoed in the enclosed bay. "End of the line, ladies," the transport officer shouted, banging his baton against the wire mesh separation. "Welcome to the oubliette." The rear doors swung open. The air that rushed in was colder than the bus, recycled and tasting of rust. This facility didn't exist on any public map. It was a hole in the earth where the government buried its mistakes. Jane shuffled forward, feigning a stumble as she reached the steps. She engaged her peripheral vision, scanning the perimeter without moving her head. 2 towers. Sniper nests active at 10 and 2 o'clock. Weapons appear to be SR-25s. Fences are electrified. I can hear the 60 Hertz hum from here. "Face the wall," a guard barked, shoving her shoulder. She hit the concrete wall hard. She didn't resist. Resistance at this stage would flag her as trained. She needed to be categorized as volatile but amateur. She let out a small, pathetic whimper, shrinking away from the contact. "Strip," the guard ordered. This was the humiliation ritual, the stripping of identity. It was standard operating procedure for any supermax intake, designed to establish total dominance. Jane removed the orange transport jumpsuit. She stood naked under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, shivering theatrically. She allowed her body to tremble, a physical performance of withdrawal symptoms she didn't have. "Spread your legs. Cough." She complied. She let them invade her space. She let them take her fingerprints, her mugshot, her dignity. It was currency. She was paying the price of admission to get close to General Volkov. "You're a small one," the guard sneered, looking at her bruised ribs, injuries she had self-inflicted 2 days ago to sell the narrative of a bar brawl. "You know this is a mixed pop facility, right? The warden runs an experiment here. High-value detainees. You won't last a week." Jane looked up, her eyes wide and watery. She allowed a single tear to track through the grime on her cheek. I just want to do my time," she stammered, pitching her voice to sound thin, terrified. The guard laughed. "Time does you in here, sweetheart." They threw a bundle of clothes at her. Rough canvas trousers, a gray t-shirt, and slip-on canvas shoes. As she dressed, Jane's fingers, still trembling for the guard's benefit, checked the seams. Loose thread on the hem, usable for a garrote if braided. The soles of the shoes are rubber, good traction on wet concrete. "Move it." They marched her down the long, echoing corridor toward Block C. The noise hit her like a physical wave. It wasn't just shouting, it was a wall of aggressive sound. 500 violent men, sensing fresh prey, slammed their cups against the bars. Clang, clang, clang. "Fresh meat!" a voice screamed from a top-tier cell. "Look at the little bird." Jane kept her eyes on the floor, counting her steps. 40 paces to the central rotunda, 12 paces to the stairwell. No cameras in the blind corner of the second landing. They stopped at cell 609. "Open 609!" the guard shouted into his radio. The heavy steel door slid open on a motorized track, grinding against the stone floor. "Get in." Jane stepped inside. The cell was a 6x8 concrete box, a steel bunk, a stainless steel toilet, and a small metal shelf. The door slammed shut. Boom! The lock engaged with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. Jane stood in the center of the cell. She waited. She listened to the guard's footsteps retreating down the tier. She listened until the heavy blast door at the end of the block closed, sealing the wing. Then, the posture changed. The slouch vanished. Her spine straightened. The trembling in her hands stopped instantly. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a cold, reptilian calculation. She walked to the sink and turned on the tap. The water ran brown for a second, then clear. She splashed it on her face, washing away the fake tears. She looked at her reflection in the polished steel mirror bolted to the wall. She didn't see a victim. She saw a viper. "Phase 1 complete," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rush of the water. "I'm in the box." She looked at the plastic toothbrush sitting on the metal shelf. It was orange, flimsy, designed to snap under pressure to prevent weaponization. Jane picked it up. She tested the weight. It was light, but the plastic was hard enough. If she ground the handle against the rough mortar of the wall for 3 hours, she could create a point sharp enough to pierce a jugular vein. She sat on the bunk. Above her, the shouting of the inmates continued, a chorus of threats and obscenities. They thought she was trapped in there with them. Jane smiled. It was a cold, humorless expression. "You have no idea," she whispered. She began to scrape the toothbrush against the wall. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The buzzer that signaled the start of the chow rotation was not a sound. It was a physical assault on the nervous system. It was a jagged electric shriek designed to spike cortisol levels and induce aggression. Jane stood at the threshold of her cell as the maglocks disengaged. The heavy steel door slid open with a grinding shudder. She stepped out onto the tier, keeping her head low, her shoulders hunched. To the guards watching from the bubble, she was inmate 8930, a terrified woman trying to make herself small. To Viper, she was a scout entering enemy territory. The walkway was a cage of mesh and steel. Below, on the ground floor, the noise of Block C rose like heat. It was a cacophony of shouting, swearing, and the slapping of dominoes against metal tables. This was the general population of the oubliette, a mix of domestic terrorists, cartel enforcers, and violent sociopaths who had been deemed too dangerous for standard federal prisons, but not valuable enough for the black sites. "Move it, 609, a guard shouted, prodding her with a baton. Jane stumbled forward, feigning a trip. As she regained her balance, her eyes swept the tier. Observation: 2 guards at the checkpoints, both bored, complacent. Their holsters were level 2 retention, easy to defeat. Observation: the blind spot she had calculated from the bus ride was real. The camera on the southeast corner was static, not panning. A 3-second window of invisibility. They herded her down the stairs and into the cafeteria. The smell hit her instantly, a nauseating blend of boiled cabbage, industrial bleach, and unwashed bodies. The humidity was oppressive. Jane took a plastic tray. She moved through the line, accepting a ladle of gray, gelatinous slop without complaint. She didn't look at the server. She was busy mapping the ecosystem. The cafeteria was segregated by unwritten laws of violence. The Aryan Brotherhood held the tables near the weight pile. The cartels held the south wall. The jihadists held the east. It was a feudal system carved out of concrete. But Jane wasn't looking for gangs. She was looking for the aristocracy. She found them in the center. It was a single round table, bolted to the floor like the rest, but the space around it was empty. No one sat within 5 feet of it. At the table sat 3 men. They weren't wearing the standard issue canvas rags. Their uniforms were tailored, pressed. They were eating real food, chicken, rice, fresh fruit, smuggled in by corrupt guards. Target acquisition, Jane thought. Her pulse steady at 55 BPM. The man in the center was Gregor, Volkov's lieutenant, a former FSB interrogator with a reputation for using power drills on kneecaps. He was laughing, peeling an orange with a small, unauthorized paring knife. He was the key. He was the gatekeeper to the high-value detainee wing where Volkov was kept. Jane needed to get close to him, but she couldn't just walk up. She needed to be invited or dragged. She turned away, looking for a place to sit. She chose a table near the dish return, occupied by a hulking man with tattoos covering his face, a lone wolf predator looking for an easy mark. She sat down. The man stopped eating. He looked at her tray, then he looked at her. "You're in my seat, bitch," he rumbled. The cafeteria went quiet. The ambient noise dropped as 500 predators sensed a kill. Jane looked up. She allowed her hands to shake. I didn't know. I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix it," the man said, standing up. He was massive, easily 6'5", 300 pounds of steroid-infused muscle. "Give me your tray, and then get on the floor." This was the test. If she fought like a soldier, using leverage, joint locks, efficient strikes, she would be flagged by the guards and the inmates as an undercover asset. She would be dead by morning. She had to fight like a rat. Jane stood up, clutching her tray. "Please," she whimpered. "I'm hungry." The man laughed. He reached out to grab her throat. Jane snapped. She didn't block his hand. She didn't dodge. She let out a high-pitched, hysterical scream and swung the plastic tray with both hands, edge first. Crack. The reinforced plastic connected with the bridge of the man's nose. It shattered on impact. Blood sprayed across the table. The man roared, blinded by pain and the hot slop from her tray flying into his eyes. He swung a wild haymaker. Jane dropped to the floor, scrambling on all fours. She grabbed his ankle. She didn't use a judo sweep. She bit him. She sank her teeth into his Achilles tendon, biting down until she tasted the rubber of his shoe and the iron of his blood. The man screamed, kicking out. His boot connected with her ribs. Crack. Jane felt the rib fracture. The pain was white-hot, blinding, good. Pain was grounding. Pain sold the performance. She rolled away, grabbing a discarded metal fork from the floor. She scrambled up, her face smeared with mashed potatoes and blood. She didn't stand in a combat stance. She stood hunched, waving the fork wildly, screaming unintelligible gibberish. "Get back! Get back! The voices said you'd come! They said you'd try to take my eyes!" The giant man wiped the blood from his nose, preparing to charge. "Break it up!" The guards swarmed in. Pepper balls popped, filling the air with chemical irritant. Jane dropped the fork and curled into a ball on the floor, sobbing loudly. Through the tears, through the chaos of the guards subduing the giant, Jane looked through the gap in her arms. She looked at the center table. Grigor was watching. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was studying her. He didn't see a threat. He saw a rabid dog, a weapon that could be pointed. He nodded to one of his men. Jane closed her eyes as the guards dragged her up. They slammed her against the wall, cuffing her. "Crazy bitch," the guard muttered. "Welcome to the hole." Jane let out a wail of despair for the benefit of the audience. But inside, in the cold, silent fortress of her mind, she was marking a checklist. Objective 1. Establish cover identity as unstable, volatile, complete. Objective 2. Get Grigor's attention, complete. Objective 3. Reconnaissance of segregation unit, in progress. As they dragged her away, she spat a piece of the giant's sock out of her mouth. Phase 2 was beginning. The hole was not silent. To the untrained ear, Segregation Unit 4 was a tomb, a subterranean block of concrete where sound went to die. But to Jane, whose hearing had been tuned by years of hunting in the quietest places on Earth, the darkness was a symphony of intelligence. She sat cross-legged in the center of the cell, her eyes closed. She was not meditating. She was calibrating. Thud, drag, thud, drag. That was the guard on the night rotation, Officer Miller. He had a hip injury, likely a herniated disc based on the uneven distribution of weight in his stride. He stopped at the end of the corridor every 14 minutes to check his phone, leaving a 30-second window where his attention was completely severed from the physical world. Clink, hiss. That was the steam pipe in the plumbing chase behind the west wall. It expanded every 45 minutes. The noise masked smaller sounds, like the scraping of plastic against stone. Jane opened her eyes. The cell was pitch black, but she had already memorized the geometry. 6 steps by 4. A steel toilet bolted to the floor, a concrete slab for a bed. No mattress until lights out. She reached into her mouth. During the scuffle in the cafeteria, amidst the chaos of biting the inmate and feigning hysteria, she had palmed a fragment of the shattered plastic tray. She had slipped it under her tongue before the guards cuffed her. It was a jagged 3-inch shard of high-density polycarbonate. She spit it into her hand. It was warm, slick with saliva, and utterly lethal. She moved to the corner of the cell where the concrete floor met the wall. The mortar here was rough, unfinished. It was a perfect whetstone. Jane began to work. She didn't grind frantically. That would create heat and noise. She worked with a slow, rhythmic pressure, utilizing the steam pipe's hissing cycles to mask the sound of her industry. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It was tedious, agonizing work that would have broken the mind of a civilian. But Jane wasn't a civilian. She was a creature of process. As she shaped the plastic, she let her mind drift back to the mission dossier. General Anton Volkov, the butcher of Grozny. He wasn't just a war criminal. He was a logistical genius who had privatized the prison's economy. He didn't just live here. He ruled here. The guards were his employees, the warden his business partner. To kill him, she couldn't just stab him in a hallway. She had to penetrate his inner circle. She had to become useful. The shard was taking shape. She ground the tip into a needlepoint, then serrated the edges against a chipped section of the floor. It wasn't a knife to slash with. It was a shiv to puncture. It was designed to slip between ribs and pierce the heart or the lung. It was a single-use instrument of assassination. 4 hours later, the weapon was finished. She wrapped the handle end in threads she had painstakingly pulled from the hem of her canvas trousers, creating a grip that wouldn't slip when wet with blood. She tested the point against her thumb. It drew a bead of red instantly. "Perfect," she whispered. Now she needed a place to hide it. The cell searches in segregation were frequent and brutal. They checked the toilet, the vents, the slab. Jane stood up and walked to the heavy steel door. She ran her fingers along the frame. The door was old, the paint peeling in layers. Near the top hinge, there was a gap where the metal casing had warped slightly from years of slamming. It was invisible from the outside, and too high for a lazy guard to check during a routine sweep. She wedged the shiv into the gap. It fit perfectly. Steps approached. Heavy. Fast. Not Miller. This was the extraction team, the guards who moved prisoners. Jane dropped to the floor, curling into a fetal position. She messed up her hair, pulling strands across her face. She started to rock back and forth, muttering nonsense. "They're in the walls. They're in the walls." The slot in the door slid open. A pair of eyes peered in. 609. Get up. You have a visitor. Jane didn't break character. No visitors. The voices don't like visitors. It's not a social call, the guard growled. Warden wants to see the freak who bit Titan. The door buzzed and swung open. 2 guards entered. They hauled her to her feet, cuffing her hands behind her back. Jane went limp, forcing them to drag her dead weight. It was a subtle power play, making them work for every inch, making them underestimate her physical agency. As they dragged her out, she glanced at the upper hinge. The shiv was invisible in the shadows. It would be waiting for her when she returned. They marched her down a different corridor, away from the administrative block. The air changed. It became cooler, cleaner. The smell of bleach and rot was replaced by the scent of cigar smoke and expensive leather. They weren't taking her to the warden's office. They were taking her to the high-value wing. Jane's pulse remained steady at 58 beats per minute. This was it. The escalation. Her performance in the cafeteria had worked. She had demonstrated violence without discipline, the exact kind of tool a man like Volkov would want to acquire. The guard stopped at a reinforced door marked library. Inside, the guard said, unlocking the cuffs. Don't make a mess. They shoved her in and locked the door. The room was lined with books. Real books, not the paperback trash in the general library. In the center of the room sat a high-backed leather chair. General Anton Volkov sat there reading a copy of The Brothers Karamazov. He looked older than his file photos, his face a map of deep lines and silver stubble, but his eyes were sharp, predatory blue. He didn't look up as she entered. "They say you bit a man's tendon out," Volkov said. His English was perfect, accented only by a low, gravelly timbre. Jane stood by the door, rubbing her wrists. She dropped the crazy act. There was no point. A man like Volkov would smell the lie. She straightened her posture, shifting from the hunched inmate to something more dangerous. "He was in my seat," Jane said. Her voice was calm, cold. Volkov closed the book. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way she stood, balanced, weight on the balls of her feet. He saw the lack of fear. "Titan is 6'5", Volkov noted. "You are tiny. Physics was not on your side. And yet Titan is in the infirmary and you are here." "Leverage is the great equalizer," Jane replied. Volkov smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man who had found a new toy. "I have a problem, 609. I have many enemies in this facility. Competitors. They lack respect. I need someone who understands leverage. Someone who is underestimated." He stood up and walked to a small table, pouring a glass of water. "The warden thinks you are insane. The psychologist thinks you are a trauma victim. But I look at you, and I see a shark in a goldfish bowl." He offered her the glass. "Work for me," Volkov said. "And you get out of the hole. You get real food. You get protection." Jane looked at the water. She was parched. but she didn't reach for it. "What's the job?" she asked. "There is a shipment coming in next week," Volkov said. "Pharmaceuticals, another gang, the Aryan Brotherhood. They want to tax it. I want you to send a message to their leader, a message they cannot ignore." "You want me to kill him?" "No," Volkov shook his head. "Martyrs are messy. I want you to hurt him. I want you to make him afraid of the dark." Jane took the glass. She drank it in one long swallow. "Done," she said. Volkov nodded. "Good. You go back to Gen Pop tomorrow. My men will find you." He pressed a buzzer under the desk. The guards opened the door. As they dragged Jane back to the darkness of the hole, she didn't struggle. She had mapped the terrain. She had sourced a weapon. And now she had the target. Phase 2 was complete. Now the hunt truly began. The shower block in Sector C was a tiled abattoir. The air was thick with steam that smelled of sulfur, mold, and the metallic tang of old plumbing. It was an acoustic nightmare, the hiss of 40 showerheads screaming into the concrete, drowning out anything softer than a shout. Jane stood under a stream of lukewarm water, her back to the wall. She was naked, vulnerable, and completely invisible. To the other inmates, she was just a piece of scenery to be ignored or leered at. To Jane, the shower block was a tactical grid. Observation: 3 guards in the cage. 1 is reading a magazine. 2 are talking. Line of sight to the far corner is obscured by the steam density. Her target was the Dutchman. He was the lieutenant for the Aryan Brotherhood in this wing, a man Volkov had marked. He stood 3 stalls down, a massive slab of pale muscle covered in jagged prison ink swastikas. He was laughing, scrubbing his shaved head, completely unaware that his protection detail, 2 younger skinheads, had drifted toward the exit to trade cigarettes. Jane reached for her soap. Embedded inside the bar, hollowed out with painstaking precision over the last 2 nights, was the plastic shiv she had sharpened in the hole. "Target requires a message," Volkov had said. "Make him afraid of the dark." She didn't run. She didn't sneak. She walked. She moved through the steam with a casual, slippery grace. She stopped 2 feet behind the Dutchman. He didn't turn. The noise of the water masked her breathing. "Excuse me," she whispered. The Dutchman turned, a sneer already forming on his wet face. "What do you want, little?" Jane stepped inside his guard. She didn't stab him in the chest. That was for killing. She brought the plastic shiv up in a tight, vicious arc. Slash. The sharpened toothbrush cut a deep, ragged line across his forehead, just above the eyebrows. It wasn't deep enough to fracture the skull, but it severed the supraorbital veins. Blood sprayed instantly. In the heavy spray of the shower, the blood didn't clot. It ran. It poured down into his eyes, blinding him with a red curtain. The Dutchman roared, stumbling back, clawing at his face. "I can't see! My eyes!" Jane dropped to a crouch as he swung a blind, massive fist over her head. She kicked the back of his knee, forcing him down onto the wet tiles. She leaned in close to his ear, her voice dropping below the roar of the water. "Volkov owns the lights," she whispered. "Remember that when you close your eyes." She stood up. She dropped the soap, shiv still inside, into the drain trough and kicked it toward the grate. By the time the Dutchman's bodyguards realized their leader was screaming, Jane was back at her stall, washing her hair. The steam swallowed the violence as if it never happened. When the guards finally rushed in, blowing whistles and brandishing batons, Jane was just another terrified inmate cowering against the wall. But as they dragged the blinding, blood-soaked giant away, She caught the eye of the officer in the cage. He nodded. Once. Imperceptible. He was on Volkov's payroll too. 2 hours later. The transfer order came through the pneumatic tube at the guard station. Inmate 8930 was to be moved from general population to Unit A1. The aquarium. The guards didn't shackle her this time. They escorted her with a strange, quiet deference. They walked her out of the noise and filth of Sector C, through a series of heavy blast doors, and into a wing that shouldn't have existed. Unit A1 wasn't a prison block. It was a fortress within a fortress. The floors were polished. The air was filtered and cool. The cells were single occupancy with solid doors, not bars. "Welcome up, 609, the escort officer said, unlocking cell A4. "General wants to see you in the yard at 1400. Jane stepped into the cell. It had a real mattress, a toilet with a seat, a window that looked out onto a small, walled courtyard. She didn't relax. She moved to the window and scanned the yard below. This was the high-value recreation area, and there, sitting on a bench press, was General Anton Volkov. But Jane wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the men standing around him. There were 4 of them. They wore prison grays, but they didn't stand like convicts. They stood at the 4 cardinal points of the compass. They scanned sectors. They kept their hands free. One of them, a man with a thick beard, was field stripping a cigarette with one hand while watching the roofline. Spetsnaz, Jane realized, her pulse spiking for the first time that day. Or Wagner Group veterans. These weren't gangbangers. These were Tier 1 operators who had gotten themselves incarcerated specifically to act as Volkov's Praetorian Guard. The mission difficulty hadn't just spiked, it had gone vertical. Jane looked at the reflection of her own face in the glass. She had passed the audition. She was in the inner circle. But now she was locked in a cage with 5 lions, and she had nothing but a plastic toothbrush. "Phase 3, she whispered to the glass. "Infiltration." She lay down on the bunk. She closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She began to build a 3D map of the courtyard in her mind, calculating line-of-sight angles and choke points. If she was going to kill Volkov, she would have to go through the Spetsnaz first. And for that, she needed something better than a shiv. She needed an ally. She needed the medic. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, The Ally. The recreation yard for Unit A1 was a concrete box open to the sky, surrounded by 20-foot walls topped with razor wire. It was cleaner than the Gen Pop yard, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. Jane walked the perimeter. She moved with a gray man cadence, unremarkable, non-threatening, blending into the background. She wasn't part of Volkov's entourage yet. She was a satellite orbiting a black hole. She needed intel on the Spetsnaz guards, their routines, their blind spots, their weaknesses. But she couldn't ask. Questions in this place got your tongue cut out. She sat on a bench near the weight pile, watching a man wrapping a bandage around another inmate's hand. The man was older, perhaps 50, with thinning hair and the slumped shoulders of someone who had carried a heavy weight for too long. But his hands were quick, efficient. He tied off the bandage with a surgeon's knot, patting the inmate on the shoulder. "Keep it dry, Marco," the man said. "If it smells like almonds, come back to me. That means infection." This was Doc, inmate 4420. Real name, Elias Thorne, former U.S. Army combat medic, dishonorably discharged and sentenced to 20 years for stealing and selling military-grade painkillers. The dossier said he was a junkie and a thief. Jane watched him. She saw the way he checked the pulse of the inmate as he worked, an automatic, unconscious gesture. She saw the way he cleaned his hands with a scrap of alcohol wipe afterward. He's not just a junkie, she analyzed. He misses the work. He craves the utility. She waited until Marco left, then slid onto the bench next to Thorne. "You tied that knot too tight," she said, staring straight ahead. "You'll cut off the circulation." Thorne didn't look up. He was organizing his small kit of stolen medical supplies. Band-aids, ointment, aspirin. It needs compression to stop the weeping. He punched a wall. He punched a face, Jane corrected. "I saw the teeth marks on his knuckles." Thorne paused. He turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes were tired, yellowed at the edges, but sharp. "You're the new girl," he said. "The one who blinded the Dutchman." "I heard you sell things," Jane said, ignoring the title. "I trade things," Thorne corrected. "Information, favors, aspirin. What do you want? Oxy? Fentanyl? I don't deal in the hard stuff anymore, but I know who does." "I don't want drugs," Jane said. She leaned in closer. "I want to know about the bearded man, the one guarding Volkov." Thorne stiffened. He looked at the Spetsnaz operator by the gate, the one Jane had clocked earlier. "You have a death wish, girl," Thorne whispered, gathering his kit. "That's Yuri, ex-Vimple. He killed 3 men in the shower block last year with a wet towel. You stay away from him." "He has a limp," Jane said. "Left leg. He favors it when he turns." Thorne stopped. He looked at Yuri again. "I didn't notice." "You noticed," Jane said. "You're a medic. You see pathology. You see weakness. You just stopped looking because you gave up." It was a calculated insult, a probe to find his pride. Thorne's jaw tightened. "I didn't give up. I survived. There's a difference." "Is there?" Jane asked. "You're patching up knuckles for gangbangers in a concrete box. You used to save lives in Fallujah. Now you're just maintenance for the meat grinder." Thorne stood up to leave. "Find another dealer, 609. I can get you access to the infirmary." Jane dropped the hook. Thorne froze. The infirmary was the holy grail, real medicine, real tools, and for a man like Thorne, a chance to feel like a doctor again. "You're lying," Thorne said, but he didn't walk away. "Volkov trusts me," Jane lied. "He needs a personal physician, someone discreet, someone who isn't a prison hack. I can recommend you." "And what do you want in exchange?" "Eyes," Jane said. "I need you to watch Yuri and the others. I need to know what pills they take. I need to know who sleeps when. I need to know where the weak points are in that human wall." Thorne looked at her. He saw the cold calculation in her face. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that she wasn't just a violent inmate. She was an operator, like the men she was hunting. "Who are you?" Thorne whispered. "I'm the cure," Jane said. She stood up. "Watch Yuri. Tell me about the leg, and I'll get you back into a white coat." She walked away, leaving Thorne standing in the middle of the yard. She felt his eyes on her back. She had him. He was desperate for redemption, and she had just offered him a lifeline. Now she had an asset. But as she crossed the yard toward Volkov's table, the bearded man, Yuri, turned his head. He looked at Jane. His eyes were dead, flat shark's eyes. He didn't blink. He knew she was watching. The cafeteria hummed with a kinetic energy that tasted like copper. It was the specific, high-frequency vibration of 500 men waiting for permission to explode. Jane sat at a corner table nursing a cup of lukewarm water. Her eyes, seemingly vacant, were actually tracking the shift rotation of the Sortie Response Team, SRT. The guards in the tower were changing shift at 1200. That meant a 2-minute window where the Overwatch was distracted by the handover of keys and logs. Time to check. 11:58. She looked across the room. The Aryan Brotherhood table was tense. The blinding of the Dutchman had left a power vacuum, and the younger lieutenants were posturing, desperate to prove they weren't weak. 3 tables away, the cartel faction was laughing, loudly mocking the blind Cyclops. It was a powder keg. Jane just needed to be the match. She stood up, holding her plastic tray. She had modified it. Underneath the lip of the tray, held in place by a dab of sticky mashed potato, was a sharpened piece of metal she had scavenged from the chain-link fence in the yard. It wasn't a weapon for her. It was a prop. She walked toward the dish return, plotting a vector that would take her directly between the 2 warring factions. As she passed the cartel table, she stumbled. It was a calculated slip, executed with the precision of a stunt performer. She crashed into the shoulder of Hector, a mid-level cartel enforcer. Her tray clattered to the floor. The metal shiv dislodged, sliding across the linoleum until it stopped right at the boot of the Aryan lieutenant, a man named Miller. The cafeteria went silent. Miller looked at the shiv. He looked at Hector. He looked at Jane, who was cowering on the floor, looking terrified. "He tried to shank me!" Jane screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Hector. "He tried to stab me and missed!" It was a lie. A beautiful, incendiary lie. Miller didn't ask questions. He saw a weapon near his foot. He saw a cartel soldier standing over a woman. He saw an excuse. "You dirty spick!" Miller roared. He didn't reach for the shiv. He picked up his heavy metal seat, bolted to the floor, but loose enough if you had the adrenaline, and swung it. The bolts sheared with a sound like a gunshot. The chair slammed into Hector's face. Crunch. That was the signal. The room detonated. It wasn't a brawl. It was a tidal wave. 500 men surged forward. Trays became shields. Forks became daggers. The sound was deafening, a roar of rage that drowned out the klaxons immediately blaring from the ceiling. "Code red! Code red! Cafeteria!" Jane didn't fight. She stayed low, crawling through the forest of kicking legs and falling bodies. She moved like a cockroach, immune to the chaos because she understood its geometry. She wasn't trying to survive the riot. She was using it as cover. She reached the service door behind the kitchen serving line. It was mag-locked, programmed to seal in the event of a riot to protect the civilian kitchen staff. But Jane knew the override. She had watched the trustees punch it in for 3 days. 1984. The keypad beeped. The lock disengaged. Jane slipped inside the kitchen just as a tear gas canister smashed through the cafeteria window, filling the dining hall with white, choking chemical smoke. She closed the door. The roar of the riot was instantly muffled, replaced by the hum of industrial refrigerators. She was out of the kill box, and she was the only thing moving in the back of the house. The kitchen smelled of grease and sanitizer. It was empty. The civilian staff had fled to their safe rooms at the first sign of trouble. Jane moved quickly. She grabbed a boning knife from a magnetic rack. A real weapon, sharp steel, not sharpened plastic. She tucked it into her waistband. She didn't stop to admire it. She needed a uniform. She found a laundry bin near the loading dock. Inside were soiled chef's whites, and more importantly, a discarded guard's jacket left by an officer who had likely changed into riot gear. She put on the jacket. It was too big, but it covered her prison grays. She found a baseball cap on a shelf and pulled it low. Disguise active. Efficacy low. Range medium. She needed to get to the service elevator. The elevator that bypassed the cell blocks and went straight to the roof and the high-value detainee wing. She walked out of the kitchen into the service corridor. The alarms were blaring here too, strobing red lights bouncing off the concrete. "Hey, you!" a voice from behind. Jane froze. She didn't turn. "Stop right there. Identify." It was a guard. Judging by the voice, young, panicked, probably separated from his squad during the initial response. Jane turned slowly, keeping her head down. "Kitchen staff," she mumbled. "I got left behind." The guard advanced, his baton raised. He was wearing a gas mask, his eyes obscured. "Get against the wall. Hands on your head." He was close, too close. He reached out to grab her shoulder. Jane exploded. She drove the heel of her palm into the diaphragm of his gas mask, aiming for the exhale valve. The plastic shattered. The guard gasped, choking on the broken pieces. Before he could recover, Jane swept his leg. He hit the floor hard. She was on him instantly, her knee pinning his gun arm. She drew the boning knife. She didn't kill him. Killing a guard now would trigger a manhunt that would lock down the facility too tight. She needed him quiet, not dead. She reversed the knife and slammed the heavy handle into his temple. Thud. The guard went limp. Jane searched him. She found what she needed, a proximity keycard clipped to his belt. Access level, orange. It wasn't the master key, but it would get her onto the elevator. She dragged the unconscious man into a janitor's closet and locked the door. "Sleep tight," she whispered. She reached the service elevator. She swiped the card. The light turned green. The doors slid open. She stepped inside. There were no cameras here. The staff used this lift to move contraband, and they had disabled the surveillance years ago. Intelligence gathered from Doc Thorne had paid off. She pressed the button for level 5, the high-value wing. The elevator began to rise. The sound of the riot below faded, replaced by the smooth hum of the hydraulics. Jane checked her reflection in the polished metal doors. She looked like a nightmare. Blood on her collar, a stolen jacket, a knife in her hand. But she wasn't inmate 609 anymore. Viper was active. Level 5 was silent. The air conditioning here was aggressive, chilling the sweat on Jane's neck. The floor was carpeted, absorbing the sound of her canvas shoes. This wasn't a prison. It was a hotel for monsters. Jane stepped out of the elevator. She scanned the corridor. Observation: 2 guards at the nurses' station, both watching the monitors, fixated on the riot downstairs. They were distracted, laughing at the violence on the screen. Observation: Volkov's cell, Suite 1, was at the end of the hall. The door was solid oak, reinforced with steel. Jane pulled the cap lower. She walked toward the nurses' station, adopting the posture of a terrified staff member. "Excuse me," she said, pitching her voice high and breathless. "They told me to bring the meds." The guard on the left turned. "What? Who are you?" "Kitchen," Jane said, holding up empty hands. "The riot. They sent me up the back way. Is this level 4? "This is level 5, you idiot," the guard sneered, standing up. "Restricted access. How did you get a key card?" "I found it," Jane stammered. "Please, I just want to hide." The guard stepped around the desk. He reached for his radio. "Control, we have a stray on level 5. Possible breach." He never finished the transmission. Jane lunged. She didn't use the knife. She used the pen sitting on the counter. She grabbed it and drove it into the guard's hand, pinning it to the desk. He screamed. The second guard went for his gun. Jane vaulted over the desk. She kicked the chair out from under him. He fell backward, his head cracking against the floor. She spun back to the first guard, who was trying to pull the pen out of his hand. She silenced him with a precise chop to the carotid artery. He dropped. 2 down. Silence maintained, mostly. Jane checked the monitors. No alarms on this floor yet. The chaos downstairs was consuming all the attention. She walked to the end of the hall, to Volkov's door. She swiped the stolen keycard. Access denied. "Damn," she whispered. Of course, Volkov had his own security protocols. She knelt by the lock. It was a digital keypad combo. She dusted the keys with the graphite powder she had scraped from a pencil earlier in the cell. 4 keys were slightly more worn than the others. 1, 3, 5, 7. She closed her eyes. She thought like Volkov, a man of history, a man of ego. 1953, Stalin's death? No. 1917, the revolution? Too cliché. 1357, prime numbers? She tried 1735, red light. She tried 7531, red light, 1 attempt left before the lockout. She remembered the book he was reading, The Brothers Karamazov. She typed 1880, the year it was published. Green light. "You pretentious bastard," she smiled. The heavy lock clicked. Jane pushed the door open. She stepped inside. Volkov wasn't reading. He was standing in the center of the room, facing the door. He was holding a glass of wine, and behind him, stepping out of the shadows of the bathroom, was Yuri, the Spetsnaz, bodyguard, the man with the dead eyes. Yuri wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a wire garrote. "You are late, little bird," Volkov said, taking a sip of wine. "We watched you on the cameras, very entertaining." Jane let the door close behind her. She was trapped. A closed room. 2 targets. 1 knife. She looked at Yuri. He smiled, wrapping the wire around his gloved hands. "I hope you fight better than you cook," Yuri said. Jane dropped the oversized guard jacket. She stood in her gray tank top, muscles coiled. "I don't cook," Jane said. "I clean." She raised the knife. The air in the suite shifted, heavy with the sudden, violent displacement of oxygen as Yuri lunged. He didn't scream. He didn't telegraph the move. He simply erased the distance between them. The wire garrote pulled taut between his gloved hands, aiming for her throat. Jane dropped. She didn't try to block the wire. Catching it meant losing fingers. She collapsed her structure, falling into a deep squat, letting the wire hiss through the air where her neck had been a fraction of a second before. As Yuri's momentum carried him forward, Jane exploded upward. She drove the boning knife toward his femoral artery. Yuri twisted, his reflexes honed by years in the Vimple unit. He took the blade on his thigh armor, a hidden ceramic plate under his prison graze. The knife skidded, sparking against the weave. He brought his knee up, slamming it into Jane's jaw. The impact threw her back against Volkov's mahogany desk. Her vision swam, a kaleidoscope of white light and pain. She tasted copper. "Sloppy," Yuri grunted. He wrapped the wire around his fist, advancing. "You rely too much on surprise." Jane spat blood onto the expensive Persian rug. "And you rely too much on armor." She grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the desk and hurled it. Yuri batted it aside with his forearm, shattering it. The distraction bought her a second. She vaulted over the desk, putting the furniture between them. Volkov watched from the corner, sipping his wine, seemingly bored by the violence destroying his quarters. He reached for a panel on the wall. "Finish her, Yuri," Volkov said. "The riot downstairs is being contained. I need to move." Yuri kicked the desk, driving it into Jane's ribs. She gasped. The wind knocked out of her. He reached over, grabbing her hair, yanking her head back to expose her throat for the wire. Jane didn't fight his grip. She went with it. She planted her feet against the desk and pushed back, driving the top of her head into his nose. Crunch. Yuri roared, his grip loosening. Jane spun inside his guard. She abandoned the knife. She grabbed his beard with one hand and his ear with the other, twisting his neck with a violent, snapping torque. It wasn't enough to break the spine, but it tore the cartilage. Yuri stumbled back, blinded by pain. Jane recovered her knife from the floor. She stepped in. She didn't aim for the armor this time. She aimed for the eyes. She drove the blade into his left eye socket. Yuri stiffened. He let out a low, gurgling sound as his body went into shock. Jane didn't pull the knife out. She twisted it, severing the brainstem. The giant Russian collapsed. Jane stood over him, her chest heaving. She looked at Volkov. The general wasn't afraid. He was smiling. He pressed the button on the wall panel. "Impressive," Volkov said. "But you are thinking tactically, not strategically. You killed the rook. You forgot the pawns." The heavy oak door to the corridor burst open. They weren't Spetsnaz. They were regular guards. 6 of them. Young, terrified, conscripted men who worked for Volkov because he paid them more than the state did. They held batons and tasers, not knowing they were walking into a room with a Tier 1 asset. "Kill her!" Volkov ordered, stepping into a hidden escape passage behind a bookcase. "Kill her and I double your salary." The guards hesitated. They looked at the dead giant on the floor. They looked at the small, bloody woman. "Get her!" the lead guard shouted, raising his baton. Jane looked at them. They weren't soldiers. They were obstacles. They were fathers, sons, husbands who were just trying to survive the prison economy. In a moral world, she would disable them. She would knock them out. But Viper didn't live in a moral world. She lived in a time crunch. Every second she wasted on them was a second Volkov used to escape. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The first guard swung. Jane ducked, slashing his hamstring. He screamed and fell. She didn't stop. She moved through them like a thresher through wheat. She picked up Yuri's dropped garrote wire. She used it on the second guard, pulling it tight until his trachea collapsed. She heard the wet snap of cartilage. She felt him die against her back. The third guard tried to run. Jane threw the boning knife. It caught him in the base of the neck. He dropped. The remaining 3 panicked. They swarmed her, a clumsy mass of limbs and fear. Jane gouged eyes. She crushed throats. She broke fingers. She turned the room into an abattoir. It took 45 seconds. When it was over, 6 men lay on the floor. Some were dead. Some were dying, choking on their own blood. The room smelled of excrement and iron. Jane stood in the center of the carnage. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. She looked at the bodies. These men hadn't been the target. They were just meat thrown into the grinder to slow her down, and she had ground them up without hesitation. She looked at her reflection in the shattered mirror above the fireplace. She was covered in blood that wasn't hers. This was the moral injury. This was the stain that didn't wash off. She had just slaughtered 6 men who were likely just trying to feed their families, all to get to one monster. "You're corroding," she whispered to her reflection. "You're rusting." She turned away from the bodies. She walked to the bookcase. The secret door was closed. Volkov was gone. She wiped the blood from her hands onto the curtains. She picked up Yuri's radio. "Phase 3 failed," she said to the empty room. "Initiating pursuit." She wasn't Jane anymore. She wasn't even Viper. She was something worse. She kicked the secret door open and stepped into the darkness. The secret passage was narrow, a service chase running between the prison walls. It smelled of dry rot and old secrets. Jane moved quickly, the flashlight she had scavenged from one of the dead guards cutting a beam through the dust. She could hear Volkov ahead of her. He was heavy, older, his breathing labored. He wasn't running, he was retreating. But then a new sound echoed through the facility. Klaxon, klaxon, klaxon. Lockdown initiated, Sector A, B, and C, all personnel to containment stations. Lethal force authorized. The warden's voice boomed over the PA system. Volkov hadn't just run. He had burned the house down behind him. He had triggered a full facility lockdown. The riot downstairs was no longer a diversion. It was a death sentence for everyone inside. Jane reached the end of the service tunnel. It opened onto a catwalk high above the main cell block. She looked down. The prison was in chaos. The tear gas had cleared, replaced by smoke from burning mattresses. Bodies, inmates and guards alike, littered the floor. But the dynamic had changed. The SORT, Special Operations Response Team, had arrived. Heavily armored men in riot gear were moving in a phalanx formation, firing rubber bullets and beanbags. But among them, moving with a different purpose, were men in black tactical gear. Not prison guards. Cleaners, Jane realized. Volkov had called in his insurance policy, a private military contractor team sent to sanitize the facility. Their ROE was simple: no witnesses. Jane spotted Volkov. He was on the ground floor, flanked by 4 of the black-clad mercenaries. They were moving him toward the loading dock. She raised the HK-416 she had taken from the armory. No, wait. She didn't have a rifle. She had a knife and a garrote. She had left the dead guards' weapons because they were non-lethal tasers and batons. She was unarmed against a kill team. "Improvise," she hissed. She scanned the catwalk. Above the loading dock exit was the control box for the heavy blast shutters. If she could sever the hydraulic line, the shutters would drop, sealing the exit. But the control box was on the other side of the block. 50 meters of exposed catwalk. A spotlight from the floor swept up and caught her. "Contact high, catwalk!" Bullets sparked against the railing. The mercenaries opened fire with suppressed carbines. The rounds snapped past her head, buzzing like angry hornets. Jane sprinted. She didn't run in a straight line. She zigzagged, vaulting over ductwork, sliding under pipes. The metal ringing of bullets hitting the walkway followed her. She felt a sharp sting in her left shoulder. A graze. It burned, but the arm still worked. She reached the control box. It was locked. She didn't have time to pick it. She used the heavy base of the flashlight and smashed the lock. She ripped the panel open. Inside were the hydraulic lines. She raised her knife to cut them. "Drop it!" A voice from behind her. Jane froze. She turned her head slowly. Standing 10 feet away, aiming a Glock 17 at her head, was Doc Thorne, the medic, the ally she had manipulated. He looked terrified. He was wearing a guard's jacket he must have stolen. He was shaking. "Doc," Jane said, keeping her hands visible. "Put the gun down." You killed them," Thorne stammered. "I saw the bodies in the suite. You slaughtered them. They were going to kill me. They were kids. They were guards." Thorne's voice cracked. "Who are you? You aren't an inmate. You aren't crazy." "I'm the only way you get out of here alive," Jane said. "Look down there, Elias. Look at the men in black." Thorne looked over the railing. He saw the mercenaries executing wounded inmates. Double taps to the head. Efficient. Cold. "They're cleaning house," Jane said. "That includes you. That includes me. Volkov is tying up loose ends." Thorne looked back at her. He was struggling with the reality of it. The woman he had helped was a monster, but the men downstairs were worse. "If I cut this line," Jane said, pointing to the hydraulics, The door seals. Volkov stays. We can use the confusion to get to the roof. And then what? Thorne asked. You kill me too? If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead, Jane said. I need a medic. My shoulder is grazed. It was a calculated lie. She didn't need a medic for a graze. She needed an extra pair of eyes. She needed a mule. Thorne lowered the gun. He looked at the carnage below. He made his choice. Cut the line, he whispered. Jane slashed the hydraulic hose. Fluid sprayed out. Clang boom. The massive steel shutter on the loading dock slammed down, cutting off Volkov's escape route. Below, Volkov shouted in rage. The mercenaries turned their weapons upward. Run, Jane said. She grabbed Thorne and dragged him into the darkness of the upper ventilation plant. The hunter had become the hunted, but she had just locked the wolves in the cage with her. The power cut was sudden and absolute. Jane had found the main breaker for the cell block lighting grid in the ventilation plant. She didn't just flip the switch. She jammed her knife into the transformer, shorting the entire circuit. Sparks showered down like fireworks, and then the oubliette lived up to its name. Darkness swallowed the prison. Stay close, Jane whispered to Thorne. Touch my shoulder. Do not let go. I can't see anything, Thorne hissed. They can't either, Jane lied. The mercenaries would have night vision goggles, NVGs. She knew this. She was counting on it. NVGs were a massive advantage, but they had a weakness. They tunnel-visioned the user. They robbed depth perception. And in a high-contrast environment, sudden light could blind them. Jane reached into her pocket. She still had the lighter she had taken from the Aryan Brotherhood table days ago. And she had a can of aerosol hairspray she had swiped from the guard's locker room during her escape from the kitchen. A poor man's flamethrower. We're going to the armory, Jane said. I need a gun. The armory is on the ground floor, Thorne whispered. That's where they are. Exactly. They're hunting us in the rafters. We go low. They moved through the service stairs. The noise of the prison had changed. The screaming had stopped, replaced by the tense, tactical silence of a hunt. The mercenaries were sweeping the building. Jane engaged her auditory memory. She mapped the footsteps. 3 sets of boots. Heavy tread. Moving in a stack formation on the second tier. She reached the landing. She pushed Thorne into a janitor's closet. Wait here. Count to 60. If I'm not back, you run for the roof. Wait, what are you? Jane slipped out before he could finish. She moved into the corridor. She closed her eyes. She didn't need to see. She needed to listen. Crunch. Crunch. The point man was 10 feet away. She could hear the whine of his NVG electronics. Jane lit the lighter. She held the hairspray can in front of the flame. She stepped around the corner. Smile, she whispered. She depressed the nozzle. Whoosh! A tongue of fire, 6 feet long, erupted in the pitch-black hallway. To the naked eye, it was blinding. To a man wearing light-amplifying goggles, it was a supernova. The sensors in the NVGs overloaded instantly, whiting out the display with blinding intensity. The mercenary screamed, tearing the goggles off his face. Jane dropped the can and the lighter. She stepped into the darkness that followed the flash. She swept the mercenary's leg. He hit the floor. She was on him before he landed. She grabbed his knife from his sheath and drove it into his throat. She grabbed his rifle, a suppressed SIG MCX. She checked the mag, full. She grabbed his NVGs. They were auto-gated. They had shut down to protect the tubes, but they would reset in a few seconds. She put them on. The world turned green. Now it's a fair fight, she whispered. She keyed the dead mercenary's radio. One down, she said into the mic, her voice cold and distorted. 5 to go. She heard the confusion on the net, the panic. They realized the predator wasn't trapped. She was geared up. Jane went back to the closet. She opened the door. Thorne was huddled in the corner, counting. 42, 43. Jane stood there looking like a demon with her glowing green eyes and the assault rifle. "Time's up, Doc," she said. "Let's go hunting." The world through the phosphorus tube of the night vision monocular was a grain-heavy landscape of neon green and shadow. It stripped away humanity, reducing targets to heat signatures and movement. To Jane, this was the natural state of the world. She moved down the administrative corridor with a fluid, rolling gait, the suppressed SIG MCX raised tight against her shoulder. Behind her, Doc Thorne stumbled, his breathing loud and ragged in the dead silence of the facility. He was trying to be quiet, but he was a medic, not a hunter. He was heavy-footed, terrified, and alive only because Jane allowed it. 3 contacts, Jane whispered, her voice barely vibrating her throat mic. Lobby. 12 o'clock. She could see them through the glass partition of the main administrative atrium. 3 of Volkov's mercenaries. They were sweeping the room with weapon-mounted lights, their beams cutting white cones through the darkness. They were blind. They were looking for shadows, unaware that the shadow was already watching them. "Stay here," Jane ordered Thorne. "Cover the rear." She didn't wait for an acknowledgement. She slipped into the room. She moved along the wall, using the dead space between the filing cabinets. The mercenaries were disciplined, moving in a standard triangular formation, but they were reliant on their lights. They had created their own tunnel vision. Jane raised the rifle. She didn't aim for the head. They were wearing ballistic helmets. She aimed for the T-box of the face or the pelvic girdle. Foot. 2 shots. Subsonic rounds. The point man dropped without a sound, his throat destroyed. The second man turned, his light sweeping toward the noise. Jane was already moving. She stepped inside his guard, using the barrel of her rifle to hook his sling, pulling him off balance. She drove her knife into the soft armor under his armpit. He gasped, a wet, bubbling sound, and slumped. The third man fired blindly. Crack, crack. The rounds shattered the glass partition, missing Jane by inches. She dropped to a slide, coming up under his line of fire. She fired 3 rounds into his upper thigh, shattering the femur. As he fell, she finished it with a single round to the temple. Silence returned to the atrium. Jane stood up. Her pulse was steady at 60 beats per minute. This was the flow state, the chemical clarity of violence. "Clear," she said. Thorne entered the room. He looked at the bodies, then at Jane. He looked sick. You didn't even hesitate." "Hesitation is a casualty," Jane said. She checked her magazine. "The warden's office is up those stairs. That's where Volkov is." They moved up the central staircase. The heavy oak doors of the warden's suite were closed. There was light leaking from underneath, the only light in the building. Volkov had restored power to this specific sector. He wanted them to come. Jane stacked up on the doorframe. She looked at Thorne. "When we go in, you watch the corners. Do not watch Volkov. Watch the room. If anyone else moves, you put them down. Can you do that?" Thorne gripped the Glock 17 she had given him earlier. His knuckles were white. "I can do it." Jane kicked the door. It swung open with a heavy crash. The office was lavish, a stark contrast to the concrete hell below. Persian rugs, mahogany furniture, and a wall of monitors. In the center of the room, Warden Hatcher sat in his high-backed leather chair. His head was tipped back. His throat opened from ear to ear. The blood had pooled on the desk, dripping onto the expensive carpet. Standing by the window, looking out at the dark prison yard, was General Anton Volkov. He turned slowly. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a glass of scotch. He wore a tactical vest over his prison grays, and he looked calm, almost bored. "Viper," Volkov said. His voice was smooth, filling the room. "I expected you sooner. The power cut was a nice touch. Theatrical." Jane entered the room, keeping her rifle trained on his chest. "Put the glass down, Anton. Hands on your head." Volkov smiled. He took a sip of the scotch. "You went through a lot of trouble to get here. The riot, the fire, killing my men. You are very expensive, my dear." "Asset recovery is a costly business," Jane said. "Thorne, clear the bathroom." Thorne moved nervously to check the side door. "Clear," he called out. "It's just us," Volkov said. He set the glass down. "You know, Hatcher thought he was in charge. He thought he ran this facility. He didn't understand that power isn't about keys. It's about leverage." He looked at Jane, his eyes narrowing. "And you. You are just a tool, a knife thrown by a coward in Langley. Do you even know why you are here, Jane? Or whatever name they gave you this week?" "I'm here to close the file," Jane said. "The Blue Jay file?" Volkov laughed. "Is that what they told you? That I had a file? There is no file. I am the file. I am the only living witness to what your handlers did in Damascus." Jane's finger tightened on the trigger. "On your knees." Volkov didn't kneel. He moved. He was fast for an older man. He kicked the heavy oak desk, sending it sliding toward Jane. She fired, the rounds burying themselves in the wood. Volkov used the distraction to close the distance. He didn't go for a weapon. He went for her weapon. He grabbed the barrel of the MCX, twisting it with a strength that belied his age. Jane let go of the rifle. Holding onto it would only give him leverage. She transitioned to her knife. She slashed at his face. Volkov blocked the strike with his forearm. He was wearing Kevlar bracers. He punched her in the ribs, a short, brutal hook that drove the air from her lungs. Jane stumbled back, crashing into a bookshelf. Books and glass rained down. "You fight like a soldier," Volkov sneered, advancing. "Predictable." He pulled a hidden blade from his belt, a karambit. Jane recovered. She spat blood. "And you talk like a politician. Boring." She engaged. They met in the center of the room. It was a blur of steel and limbs. Volkov was strong, skilled in systema, using momentum and joint locks. Jane was faster, using Krav Maga and dirty street tactics. He slashed at her throat. She ducked, driving her shoulder into his solar plexus. He grunted, but didn't fall. He grabbed her hair, yanking her head back, exposing her neck for the killing stroke. Jane didn't fight the pull. She went with it, driving her boot backward into his knee. Crack! Volkov roared, his leg buckling, his grip loosened. Jane spun, breaking his hold. She grabbed his knife hand, twisting the wrist until the karambit dropped. She swept his remaining leg, sending him crashing to the floor. She was on him instantly, her knee on his chest, her knife pressed against his jugular. "Do it!" Thorne yelled from the doorway, his gun raised but shaking too much to fire safely. Volkov looked up at her. He wasn't afraid. He was breathing hard, blood on his teeth. "Go ahead," Volkov whispered. "Cut the throat, silence the witness. That is what you are, isn't it? A cleaner." Jane looked down at him. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold reality of the kill. He was right. She was a cleaner. She sanitized the messes made by men in suits, but Volkov saw the hesitation. He saw the flicker of moral injury in her eyes. Wait, he gasped. I can give you names. I can give you the people who sent you, the people who burn agents like matches. Jane pressed the knife harder, drawing a bead of blood. I don't care about names, she whispered. You should, Volkov said, because the extraction team that is coming for you, they aren't coming to rescue you, Viper. They are coming to sanitize the site. That includes you. Jane froze. It fit. The lack of comms, the lockdown, the sheer number of mercenaries. You're lying, she said. Check your radio, Volkov challenged. Switch to the emergency channel. Listen to what they are saying. Jane looked at Thorne. Check it. Thorne fumbled with the radio he had taken from the dead guard. He tuned it. Static. Then a voice. Clear. American. Eagle 1 to ground. Site sanitization approved. No survivors. Repeat, no survivors. Confirm asset Viper is down. Jane looked at the radio. Then she looked at Volkov. The mission was a lie. It wasn't an extraction. It was a liquidation. She pulled the knife away from his throat, but she didn't let him up. Get up, she ordered, her voice changing. The coldness remained, but the target had shifted. Phase 4, she whispered to herself. Survival. The warden's office was a vacuum of high-tension silence, broken only by the distant, muffled thud of the sortie response team breaching the cell blocks below. Jane hauled General Volkov to his feet. He was heavy, smelling of expensive scotch and fear sweat. His knee was shattered, forcing him to lean heavily on the mahogany desk, wheezing. The extraction team, Volkov gasped, gesturing at the radio Thorne was still clutching. They will be here in minutes. The roof. We can use the helipad access. I have the key. He tapped a heavy signet ring on his finger against the wood. Biometric encryption. Only I can open the roof access door. You need me, Viper. Jane looked at him. Her face was a mask of gore and indifference. She didn't look at the ring. She looked at the tactical map on the wall of monitors. The cameras showed black-clad figures moving through the smoke in Sector B. They were moving efficiently, double-tapping bodies on the floor. Sanitization. Thorne, Jane said, her voice flat. Barricade the door. Use the bookshelf. Thorne hesitated, his eyes darting between Jane and the war criminal. You heard the radio? They're coming to kill us. We need a way out. Do it, Jane snapped. Thorne holstered his pistol with shaking hands and began to shove the heavy oak bookcase across the double doors. Jane turned her attention back to Volkov. She grabbed his collar and slammed him into the high-backed leather chair. The roof access, she said. Unlock it. Volkov smiled, a thin, bloody expression of triumph. He thought he had won. He thought he was the indispensable asset. He reached for the console built into the desk. You see? Volkov said, his fingers dancing over the keyboard. We are the same, you and I. Professionals in a world of amateurs. The agency uses us, breaks us, and throws us away. But we survive. The monitor beeped. Roof access unlocked. There, Volkov said, leaning back. The path is open. Now we must move. My men, the ones who are left, they might have a chopper inbound. We can make a deal. He looked at Jane, expecting a nod, a handshake, a transactional agreement. Jane looked at the screen. Unlocked, she looked at the tactical feed. The cleaners were at the elevator bank. 2 minutes. You're right, Jane said softly. The agency does throw us away. She stepped behind the chair. Volkov stiffened. What are you doing? We need to go. I needed the door open, Jane whispered into his ear. I don't need you. Volkov's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to scream, to beg, to offer more money, more names, the location of bodies buried in the desert. "Wait! I have accounts. I have the names of the senators who—" Jane didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She fulfilled the archetype of the corroded operative, the weapon that had been sharpened until it cut everything it touched. She wrapped her arm around his head, exposing the throat. With her other hand, she drove the knife, his own, karambit, into the soft hollow beneath his jaw. She didn't just stab, she pulled. It was a violent lateral tear. Volkov didn't scream. He gurgled, a wet, choking sound as the airway and the arteries were severed in a single motion. Blood sprayed across the desk, soaking the keyboard and the expensive monitor. Jane held him while he thrashed. It took 10 seconds. The life went out of him in a series of spasming jerks, leaving him heavy and limp. She let go. The body slumped forward onto the desk, sliding off onto the floor with a wet thud. Thorne turned around at the sound. He saw the blood. He saw Jane wiping the curved blade on her pant leg. "Jesus Christ," Thorne breathed, backing away until he hit the barricaded door. He opened the door. He was helping us." "He was a liability," Jane said. Her voice was steady, her heart rate seemingly unaffected by the intimacy of the kill. "He would have slowed us down. He would have betrayed us the moment he saw a better offer. And he was the target." "The target?" Thorne's voice cracked. "We're being hunted by a hit squad. The mission is over." "The mission is never over until the target is confirmed dead," Jane said. She walked over to the body. She grabbed Volkov's wrist, the one with the signet ring, and checked the pulse. Nothing. She reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, encrypted flash drive she had seen him check earlier. Intel. Leverage. "Phase 3 complete," she said to herself. "You're a monster," Thorne whispered. He looked at her with genuine fear. He wasn't looking at a rescuer anymore. He was looking at a predator who had just eaten its prey. Jane looked at him. She saw the judgment. She saw the moral horror. It didn't touch her. She was rusted inside, corroded by years of doing the things that let men like Thorne sleep at night. "I'm not a monster, Doc," she said, checking the magazine of the suppressed rifle she had recovered earlier. "I'm a professional. And right now, I'm the only reason you're still breathing." Boom. A shaped charge detonated on the other side of the oak doors. The heavy wood splintered. The bookshelf rocked. Dust poured from the ceiling. The cleaners were here. "Roof," Jane ordered. "Now." She didn't wait for him. She sprinted for the private elevator behind the warden's desk, stepping over Volkov's cooling body without a downward glance. The closed circle was collapsing. The only way out was up. The private elevator hummed, a smooth electric ascent that felt jarringly civilized compared to the slaughter they had just left behind. The interior was polished steel and mirrors, reflecting 2 shattered people. Jane leaned against the wall, checking the magazine of the SIG MCX. She had 11 rounds left. Her left arm was throbbing where the bullet had grazed her, the hasty bandage she'd applied in the dark already soaked through. Beside her, Doc Thorne stared at the floor. He was trembling, a continuous low-frequency vibration of shock. He was still wearing the stolen guard jacket, now splattered with Volkov's arterial blood. "They're going to kill us," Thorne whispered, his voice sounding small in the enclosed space. The radio said no survivors. "They're going to try," Jane corrected. She racked the charging handle, ejecting a round and catching it, inspecting the primer before rechambering it. "There's a difference." The elevator chimed. A cheerful digital sound. The doors slid open. The roof of the oubliette was a landscape of industrial chaos. HVAC units the size of trucks roared, venting steam into the night air. The wind was ferocious, whipping Jane's hair across her face. Above them, the sky was dominated by the deafening, rhythmic thumping of rotors. Whump, 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 whump. A black helicopter, an MH-60M Black Hawk without markings, hovered 10 feet above the helipad. Its searchlight cut a blinding white cone through the darkness, sweeping the roof. Jane grabbed Thorne by the collar and dragged him behind a concrete ventilation stack, just as the light swept over the elevator doors. "Stay down," she shouted over the rotor wash. "Do not move until I say." She peeked around the concrete. The helicopter wasn't landing. It was maintaining a hover. 2 ropes dropped from the side doors. Fast roping. 4 figures slid down. They hit the deck with the heavy, practiced thud of Tier 1 operators. They weren't moving like a rescue team. There were no stretchers, no medics. They moved in a diamond formation, weapons raised, scanning for targets. Their silhouette was distinct. Quad-nod night vision goggles, suppressed HK-416s, no identifying patches. These were the cleaners, the same unit that was sanitizing the cell blocks below. "Eagle 2 on deck," a voice crackled over the radio Jane had taken. "Securing the HVT extraction point. No visual on Asset Viper." "Copy, Eagle 2, the pilot's voice replied. "Sanitize the roof, then burn the building." Jane looked at the fuel tank sitting near the edge of the helipad, a refueling station for the prison's transport chopper. She looked at the cleaners. They were moving toward the elevator. She had the element of surprise, but they had superior numbers and fresh gear. She couldn't win a firefight. She had to change the geometry of the engagement. "Thorne," she yelled into his ear. "Can you fly?" Thorne looked at her, terrified. "What?" "No, I'm a medic, not a pilot." "Then you better hold on," Jane said. She broke cover. She didn't fire at the soldiers. She fired at the spotlight on the helicopter. Pop, pop, pop! 3 rounds. The searchlight shattered in a shower of sparks and glass. The roof plunged into darkness. The cleaners spun around, their night vision flaring from the sudden change in light contrast. "Contact rear! Contact rear!" Jane didn't stop moving. She sprinted toward the refueling tank. The cleaners opened fire, their suppressed rounds snapping past her like angry insects. Sparks danced on the concrete as bullets chewed up the ground at her heels. She reached the tank. She didn't shoot it. That was a movie cliché. Shooting a fuel tank just put holes in it. She pulled the pin on the last flashbang grenade she had scavenged from the armory. She tossed it under the tank's valve assembly and dove behind a steel generator housing. Bang! The flashbang detonated. It didn't ignite the fuel, but the concussive force sheared the valve. Jet fuel sprayed out under high pressure, coating the helipad in slick, flammable liquid. The vapor fumes rose instantly. The cleaners froze. They smelled it. "Fuel leak! Hold fire! Hold fire!" The team leader screamed. One spark from a muzzle flash now would turn the entire roof into a thermobaric bomb, concocted their hesitation. She scrambled up the side of the generator housing, gaining the high ground. She was now level with the hovering helicopter. The pilot was struggling to maintain the hover in the swirling winds, blinded by the loss of his searchlight. The side door was open. The crew chief was leaning out, trying to spot the threat. Jane dropped the rifle. It was empty. She took a running start and jumped. It was a desperate, impossible leap. She cleared the gap between the generator and the helicopter skid. Her hands caught the cold metal of the landing gear. The impact wrenched her injured shoulder. a white-hot spike of agony that nearly made her let go. She swung her legs up, hooking them around the skid. She pulled herself up to the door. The crew chief saw her. He reached for his sidearm. Jane grabbed his belt and yanked him forward. Gravity did the rest. He tumbled out of the helicopter, screaming as he fell toward the fuel-soaked roof below. Jane rolled inside the cabin. She pulled her knife. She lunged into the cockpit. The co-pilot turned, his eyes widening. Jane drove the knife into his shoulder between the armor plates. He shouted, his hands coming off the controls. She shoved him back against his seat, grabbing the cyclic stick. "Fly!" she screamed at the pilot, pressing the bloody knife against his throat. "Get us out of here." The pilot, seeing his co-pilot bleeding and a deranged woman covered in blood holding a blade to his jugular, made the only logical choice. He pulled the collective. The helicopter lurched upward, banking hard away from the roof. "Wait!" Jane shouted. "My extraction!" She looked down. Thorne was still huddled behind the ventilation stack. The cleaners were recovering, raising their weapons, realizing the fuel hadn't ignited. They were about to execute him. "Drop the rope," Jane ordered the pilot. "Lower us, now." "Are you crazy? They'll shoot us down." "Do it, or I cut your throat and fly this thing myself." The pilot cursed and dropped the altitude. The fast rope dangled, swinging wildly in the wind. Jane leaned out of the door. The rotor wash was deafening. "Thorne!" she screamed. "Grab the rope!" Thorne looked up. He saw the rope dancing 10 feet away from him. He saw the cleaners advancing. He saw Jane hanging out of the helicopter, her hand extended, a lifeline from hell. He stood up. He ran. Bullets sparked around him. He didn't look back. He leaped, grabbing the thick braided rope with both hands. "Go! Go! Go!" Jane hammered on the cockpit wall. The pilot floored the collective. The engines screamed. The helicopter shot upward, dragging Thorne into the air. Below them, the cleaners opened fire. Rounds punched through the fuselage. Ping, ping, ping. A warning light flashed on the dash. Hydraulic pressure low, but they were moving. They were climbing. Jane reached down, grabbing the rope. She hauled. Her muscles burned. Her shoulder screamed, but she pulled. Thorne climbed, hand over hand, his face a mask of sheer terror. She grabbed his harness and dragged him onto the floor of the cabin. They collapsed together on the metal deck, gasping for air. The wind roared through the open doors. Below them, the oubliette shrank into the distance. A moment later, a massive explosion rocked the night. The cleaners had detonated their charges, collapsing the warden's office and igniting the fuel on the roof. A pillar of fire rose into the sky, sealing the secrets of the prison forever. Jane lay on her back, staring at the ceiling of the helicopter. She was bleeding. She was exhausted. She was a traitor to her agency and a savior to a thief. Thorne sat up, looking at the burning facility. Then he looked at her. "You came back," he said, sounding surprised. Jane turned her head. Her eyes were cold, reflecting the red warning lights of the cockpit. "I needed a witness," she whispered. She closed her eyes. Phase 4 was complete. The fuel gauge on the stolen MH-60M Blackhawk glowed a steady, warning amber. Low level. The vibration of the rotors had settled into a monotonous, bone-rattling rhythm that numbed the pain in Jane's shoulder, but couldn't silence the adrenaline still spiking in her blood. She kept the helicopter low, hugging the tree line of the state forest 40 miles north of the facility. She flew nap of the earth, using the terrain to mask their radar signature from whatever AWACS or chase assets the cleaners had in the air. Beside her, the pilot she had forced to fly was silent. He was terrified, his hands white-knuckled on the collective, his eyes darting between the instruments and the bloody knife still resting on the center console. In the back, Doc Thorne sat huddled against the bulkhead, staring out at the rushing darkness, his face a mask of shock. "Set it down," Jane ordered over the internal comms. "There's no airfield," the pilot stammered. "I see a quarry clearing at 2 o'clock. Put it down, now." The pilot didn't argue. He banked the aircraft hard, flaring just above the gravel pit. Dust and loose stone whipped into a frenzy as the wheels touched the ground. The suspension groaned. "Engine off," Jane commanded. As the rotors spun down, the silence of the dawn rushed in to fill the void. It was a heavy, ringing silence, punctuated only by the ticking of cooling metal. Jane grabbed the pilot's headset and ripped it free. She used the cord to zip-tie his hands to the cyclic stick. It wouldn't hold him forever, but it would buy them time. "Get out," she signaled to Thorne. They tumbled onto the gravel. The air was cold, smelling of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the copper and feces smell of the oubliette. "Where are we going?" Thorne asked, his voice trembling. He looked at the helicopter, then at the vast, dark forest surrounding them. "They'll find the chopper. They'll track us." "Let them," Jane said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver object, a lighter. She walked to the fuel vent on the side of the aircraft. She didn't light the fuel. That would create a smoke column visible for miles. Instead, she used the lighter to melt the plastic casing of the transponder unit she had ripped from the cockpit dashboard. She crushed the electronics with her boot. "We walk from here," she said. 4 miles to the highway. We steal a car. We disappear." Thorne looked at her. In the gray light of dawn, she looked less like a human and more like a revenant. Her gray prison clothes were stained black with blood, some hers, mostly others. Her face was bruised, her eyes dark hollows of exhaustion. "Why?" Thorne asked. "Why did you come back for me? You had the helicopter. You could have flown away." Jane adjusted the bandage on her shoulder. She looked at the medic. He was a thief, a junkie, a convict. He was nobody. "I told you," she said. "I needed a witness." "To what?" Thorne asked. "To you, killing everyone? To the prison burning down?" Jane reached into the pocket of her pants and pulled out the encrypted flash drive she had taken from General Volkov's body. She held it up. It caught the first rays of the morning sun. "To this," she said. Thorne frowned. "What is it?" "Leverage," Jane said. "Volkov kept records, names, bank accounts, operations, proof that the agency sanctioned the oubliette, proof that the men who sent the cleaners were the same men paying Volkov to run his little empire." She pocketed the drive. "They tried to sanitize the site," Jane said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They tried to erase the mistake, but they missed one thing." "Me?" Thorne asked. "No," Jane said. "Me." She looked at Thorne. He was shivering. "You're free, Elias," she said. "Go west. Find a hole, stay deep. If you talk, they'll kill you. If you try to sell your story, they'll kill you. But if you disappear, you might live." Thorne stared at her. "What about you? What are you going to do?" Jane looked at the horizon. Somewhere out there, men in suits were answering phones, realizing their hit squad had failed, realizing that Viper wasn't dead, realizing that the asset they tried to burn was now coming for them. The moral injury was still there. The weight of the guards she had killed in the suite. The brutality of the riot. It would never leave. But now it had a direction. It wasn't just trauma anymore. It was fuel. "I'm going to finish the mission," Jane whispered. She turned and began to walk toward the tree line. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, her silhouette dissolving into the shadows of the forest. Thorn watched her go. He realized he didn't even know her real name. To him, she would always be the woman who broke into hell, killed the devil, and walked out the front door. He looked at the sunrise. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't an inmate. He was a survivor. "Good luck, Viper," he whispered to the empty air. He turned and ran in the opposite direction. Deep in the forest, Jane didn't look back. She checked the load in the stolen SIG MCX, 7 rounds, enough to start a war.